Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Considering Climate Change and Controlled Waters Risk Assessment. Today we are joined by Helen McMillan, an Associate Director within RSK Geoscience and led the SOBRA Climate Change and Controlled Water subgroup. Helen is a qualified hydrologist and chartered geologist with 20 years experience working in environmental consultancy. Today's webinar will provide an overview of SOBRA's report, Guidance on Assessing Risk to Controlled Waters from the UK Land Contamination under conditions of future climate change. As always, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please ask these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Just to make you aware that Helen will be turning her camera off during the presentation. Thank you everyone for attending, and I'll now hand over to Helen.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon to provide the IES webinar on considering climate change and controlled waters risk assessment. As you can see, I'm doing the presentation from home, so I am just going to switch the video off just to save bandwidth and hopefully avoid any technical glitches throughout this. So I'll do that now, and hopefully you can still see my screen. But yeah. Already had an introduction. I'm an associate director within RSK Geosciences, and I also led the SOBRA subgroup. Just a mention that although the terminology within it is controlled waters, the equivalent term in Scotland is the water environment, and in Northern Ireland they seem to use both terms. But if I'm talking about controlled waters, it's equivalent to water environment up here in Scotland. So just before I start, just to give acknowledgement and thanks to the subgroup, there were 14 of us that were represented by a mixture of consultants and regulators. We also had support from the SOBRA Executive Committee, and we also had input from regulators and data providers throughout the course of preparing the document. So it's definitely just a big thank you to everyone that was involved in the production of the document. And also thanks to you all who are hopefully have hopefully read the document and are putting it into practice. So just a quick summary of the presentation. I'm just going to start with outlining the aim of the SOBRA guidance, briefly go over legislation, policy and guidance in relation to land contamination and climate change. I'll then discuss climate change in the UK. Then go on to kind of more the real kind of nitty-gritty of the talk, where we look at conceptualizing climate change and also considering climate change through the phases of land contamination risk assessment. I've also got an example site that I'm currently working on that I am going to use as a bit of a case study to show you how I've interpreted the data, which will hopefully be useful. And then just at the end, I'll just summarize the key points of the presentation. So the aim of the SOBRA guidance was to develop clear, practical guidance to support decisions about the potential effects of future climate change through all stages of land contamination, controlled waters risk assessment in the UK. And you can download a copy of the guidance from the SOBRA website, and the link's just provided there. The guidance was published in August, so just at the end of summer. So it's been out for a bit, and it'd be interesting to know if anyone's actually been able to use the guidance in their projects. Just a bit of a summary on what the guidance does and doesn't do, I suppose, would be useful. It is specific to controlled waters. We are just looking at that as the prime receptor. It also only includes references available or data sources that were published up to the end of January last year. It's a very fast-moving science, climate change, and there was a lot of publications going in. We thought to get the guidance out, we draw a line in the sand as to what data we would review. So that's just a bit of a limitation. So be aware more guidance or data sources may have been published since then. It considers impacts from extreme weather and long-term changes in weather patterns. And really what we're wanting it to do is provide a framework for risk assessors to consider climate change and explore the consequences within controlled waters risk assessments. We really are just wanting to ensure that climate change is being considered consistently and applied across the industry to ensure that the risk assessments we complete are sustainable and robust. So briefly on UK legislation, policy and guidance, the main pieces of legislation associated with land contamination are Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act, and it's also regulated through planning policy. In terms of climate change, the two main pieces of legislation are the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Scotland Act. As part of this, there was a requirement to establish a climate change committee, and they require a UK climate change risk assessment to be published every 5 years to assess risks for the UK from the current and predicted impacts of climate change. And this has a requirement for the devolved administrations to develop national strategic adaptation programmes to manage the unavoidable effects of climate change in response to the CCRA, and they need set of actions over 5 years. And the adaptation programmes place requirements on the planning regime to incorporate the effects of climate change within their decision making. And there are planning policies for all the relevant devolved administrations, which all include reference to climate change, I should add. The need to include for potential climate change effects and land contamination risk assessments are outlined in LCRM, GPLC2 and BS 21365. It's also going to be referenced within the forthcoming WATPS 10 whenever that is published. So that's something to be aware of if you're working up in Scotland. However, before the publication of the SOBRA Guidance, and this is really what drove the need for it, there was an absence of detailed guidance on how climate change should be considered in land contamination risk assessments. One of the main reasons for this was that regulators are still developing their own policy in this area. But we were very lucky that we had representatives from the EA, CPA and NRW within our subgroup who really kind of helped provide an invaluable steer while we were producing the document. And speaking about regulatory input, just worth noting that there is a lot of research and development currently undergoing. So expect to see more publications being produced. Last year, the EA commissioned 2 projects, one in conjunction with Syria, which is a literature review on looking at key contaminants, and it kind of more focused on remedial activities on how climate change could affect land contamination. And they also had another commission with WSP, and that one was really to inform regulator considerations of climate change impacts and adaptation for waste deposits, landfill and land contamination sites. These are just internal documents for the EA, and it's really to help them with respect to environmental permitting and decision making. They aren't published to the wider audience, but it's just to make you aware that these are there. The SOBRA subgroup did have input into both of these via a series of workshops that were run. But it's maybe just to flag that maybe something will come out of that will be kind of published more widely as a result. Syria are also currently developing a guide for managing changing climate and contaminated land projects. So that's currently being developed. They also have an extreme climate incidents and contaminated land interest group. So it's just really to let you know it's a very hot topic, lots of research and development going on, and you can expect more publications on this in the future, I'm sure. So just to talk about climate change in the UK, climate change, it's defined as the large-scale long-term shift in average weather patterns and average temperatures, and it's assessed by averaging data over a 30-year period. And the most recent reference period is 1991 to 2020. The UK's, basically the Met Office produces State of the Climate reports every year. The last one is produced for the year 2021, that was published in June. So what you've got in the SOBRA document actually covers one for 2020, but this may as well provide the updated slide. And it includes a number of statistics and trends associated with the climate in the UK, which you can see in the attached graphic. Key points really to note are that the UK climate is changing. Recent decades have been warmer, wetter and sunnier than the 20th century, and climate change is likely to result in more intense extreme weather and significant weather events with a higher likelihood of heat waves, flash floods and drought. So this next slide shows projected future climate change effects and influences across the UK. And this is based on Met Office UK CP18 projections, which determine the potential impacts of climate change for the UK. Now, these are based on RCP, or Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, and this is a measure of kind of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's basically looking at worst case projections. So in effect, the world does nothing to combat climate change and global temperatures rise to 4.3 degrees C. There are other projections available which don't project such an extreme rise in temperature. However, a lot of the data that you do find is based on RCP 8.5. And I think primarily that was due to the need to be prepared for kind of maybe catastrophic climate change events that might happen, such as flooding or water resource management. It's maybe a bit extreme to apply for land contamination, but it's the data that we've got, and that's what we are basing it on. A point to note is that UK CP18 projections will be revised in the future at some point. And that's because the IPCC published revised greenhouse gas emission data last year. And it's also changing what it's called from RCP to SSPs. So there will be a change, but currently UK CP18 is the most current and available data set we've got for the UK. Really what this slide is showing is that you've got regional variations across the UK. It's not a case of a blanket approach or a blanket change is going to happen. You can see there's differences if you compare, the slides we've got for temperature up in the top left and precipitation down in the bottom. You can see there's clear differences between what's happening in the north of Scotland and, say, the southeast of England. Also, we've got sea level rise change. So the pattern of sea level rise again isn't uniform across the UK, and it's mainly due to the effects of isostatic rebound. You can see sea level rise is projected to be greater in the sort of southeast of England than it is up in sort of, say, north of Scotland or Northern Ireland. Right, so that's that slide. So moving on, just how you conceptualize climate change and what implications will it have on the conceptual site model that we have underpinning land contamination risk assessments. So this is probably just a standard CSM that you're more or less familiar with, but we've got a land contamination source shown by red and the various pathways by which it might affect nearby controlled waters receptors. And these include groundwater bodies, abstraction wells, surface water bodies, which can be both freshwater and marine, and groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems. And then we've got typical pathways that relate to controlled waters, could include groundwater flow, overland flow, and you also get dilution and attenuation of contaminants within both groundwater and surface water. This is just the base model that we're going to look at, and over the next few slides, we'll consider changes that might occur to it as a result of climate change. So this is showing changes that might result from extreme high intensity rainfall events and more long-term effects as a result of increased average annual rainfall. At surface or near surface effects. I know it's quite hard to read on the slide, but this is just reproduced from the SOBRA Guidance, so you can get the full diagram from there. But at surface or near surface effects could include increased rainfall and infiltration, which would result in increased recharge rates and runoff. You could have increase in soil saturation, reducing windblown erosion and increasing contaminant leachability. You could have erosion and remobilization of your source zone. Flash flooding causing changes to overland drainage pathways and pathway lengths. And again, similar would happen if you had localized surface water flooding, changing your pathway lengths, and also your peak river flows could change and mobilize contaminant sources that may be upstream of your site. You could have changes in your location and type of groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystem assemblages. And in terms of below ground effects, you could have a rise in groundwater levels, and that could impact on whether your contaminant sources are above or below the water table. You could also see increased seasonality in groundwater levels, particularly in the winter. Groundwater abstractions may reduce if surface water is able to sustain water supplies, and you also get increased dilution in groundwater flow rates. This one shows extreme heat events. So similarly, I'll just briefly go through a few things. So you could have land cracking, so getting desiccation, cracks forming in cohesive soils that could result in vertical migration pathways at surface. You could have increased source erosion and windblown transport. You could have in your surface water, the Q95, your low flow in rivers may decrease, so there'll be less dilution potential, and there may also be an increased importance of groundwater baseflow to sustain river flows. Below ground, you could have falling groundwater levels and potential to create perched water tables. You could have an increase in the importance of groundwater abstractions to sustain water supplies, and you'll have a reduction in dilution and groundwater flow rates. So those are just some things. There are more which are detailed in the guidance, but that's just a quick summary. Other CSM considerations: if you've got a site near the coast, you need to kind of consider sea level rise and coastal erosion. And effects could include your tidal limit moving further upstream and pathway lengths reducing. You could have groundwater levels rising, which could result in changes to hydraulic gradient in coastal aquifers. You could have increased rates of coastal erosion, changes in overland flow patterns, and saline intrusion and impacts on groundwater abstractions. So as I said, these are just a summary I'm going through in the presentation. There is much more detail in the guidance as to what to consider in your CSM. So what does this mean for our land contamination risk assessments? I think it's important to state, and what we hope the guidance makes clear, is it's something that we need to start off with our Tier 1 assessment, our preliminary risk assessment. So things that you can have a think about in terms of climate change, the design life of the proposed development, if that's applicable. Some ways you may not want to consider it, because even if there's a design life of say 30 years or 60 years, you often find developments last much longer than that, and you don't want to end up cutting that off, I suppose, by just sort of considering for the next 30 or 60 years. Other things to consider: location of your site. Is it near the sea or estuaries and tidally influenced rivers? You need to think about the location and elevation of the site in relation to projected increased flooding extents. Projected changes to groundwater recharge, for example, as a result of increased winter rainfall and frequency and intense rainfall events, or decrease in seasonal rainfall and drought conditions. And sort of think about the projected changes to regional groundwater level for defined time slices, such as for the near future, which goes up to 2049, or the far future, which is to 2079. Actually, that's something I should bring out. I should have said it in an earlier slide, but just in terms of the projection data and the UK CP18 data set, we've only got future climate change projections to the end of the century, so they only go up to 2100. So that's just something to bear in mind. Within the guidance, to help steer you and guide you through this, we have got 3 case studies that we've presented that are based on hypothetical sites. They include a site near the coast, an inland site. Also kind of cover part 2A in planning, but they kind of provide a little bit of a guide as to what you could do to apply the guidance. The other thing to think about in PRAs is why it's important to start at the outset, is does it matter? And the answer is yes, but not always. So what I'm showing in this slide is information from the eFlag portal, and this provides information on recharge to groundwater bodies in Great Britain. And you can toggle between looking at near future and far future effects, monthly versus seasonal projections, and whether you want to look at a percentage change or an absolute change in terms of projected changes to recharge. The example I'm showing here is focusing on winter recharge, as this is when recharges or greatest recharge is most likely to occur due to limited evapotranspiration. However, all data does need to be considered. I'm just putting this in as a bit of an example. And if you see here, you've got the graphic on the left is showing the baseline compared to near future, and the one on the right is showing it compared to far future. Looking at percentage change here, so where you've got 5 to 10% change in recharge, that may be something that we could normally accept as being a reasonably anticipated variation within our risk assessment. It's really those that go beyond 10%, the extremes that are going to be most significant. And when I'm talking about percentage change here in terms of recharge, we're talking about, definitely less than 1 millimeter per day change. You're talking about kind of sub-millimeter changes whenever you look at the absolute values. But you can see here on the left, for the near future, there seems to be limited locations or groundwater bodies where you're getting greater than 10% change. There are isolated bodies that you see. However, when you look at the far future, going up towards 2079, you can see the change above 10% is much greater. So it is something that needs to be considered, and it is site specific depending on where your site is located in the UK. This is just focusing on winter recharge, and as I said, you'll need to look at all data from spring, summer, autumn. You can look at it in monthly terms as well. So, and I will take you through an example site just to try and explain this a bit better. Yeah, so that's what I was just saying, flagging up the 5% change with the reasonably anticipated variation. So this is an example site. It's not one that's in our guidance. One of the case studies is one I'm actually currently working on just now. And I thought it'd be useful to show you how I've kind of thought about it. The site is located in the North Ayrshire, and it's located within the Dalry groundwater body. So the image on the left shows basically projections comparison with the baseline to the near future, which shows a 6.4% change. And then if you look at the far future, you can see the winter recharge is much greater. It's a 20.6% change based on winter recharge. Now, what eFlag also does, they provide box plots of all projected data, which is really, really useful and where a lot of the information is going to come from. We really like the eFlag portal. We think it's really useful. One thing to note is that the units are in millimeters per day, and they only provide information on, basically you can either do it seasonally or you can group it monthly. They don't do an annual cumulative effect, and that's really kind of what we're interested in. You can figure out an annual event, an annual kind of change in recharge, but you have to basically sum it up yourself. Within the box plots, there's a line you can see hopefully between these boxes here. That's the median, and we'd recommend that you sum up the medians to calculate what your annual rainfall is, and that's what I have done here. So I've done it for the baseline, near future and far future. In comparison to the baseline, for the near future is only a 1.8% change, so really minimal. It's not something that is going to really affect your risk assessment by considering that. However, for the far future, you can see there is a greater change, 9.4%. So that's kind of going towards the limit of 10% that I indicated previously as being maybe an upper range for considering kind of natural variability within risk assessments that we currently do. So it's maybe something we want to consider further. This site is also located close to a river, so to think about flooding potential, SEPA have got flood maps. This one I've just brought up shows the current risk from river flooding. And this is for a medium likelihood. So each year this area has a 0.5% chance of flooding. SEPA have also produced, and EA will have done as well, future flooding maps. And this is this overlay here. So this is by the 2080s. There's a 0.5% chance of flooding. And this one basically is combining both of them. So you can see to the west of the river, there's really no significant change to projected flooding patterns. However, you can see there is a change to the east of the river. So my site I'm looking at just now is located to the east. So that's good news for me. It indicates that flooding is not going to change in the future, certainly up to the 2080s. However, if my site was, say, located over in the east over here, it may be something that we need to be thought about because it could change your receptor length or your pathway length to the receptor. So done a PRA, looked at climate change. Is it something we need to think about further? So really at GQRA stage in tier 2, we're wanting to ensure that the site investigation that's completed has been designed to allow information to be collected to further inform the CSM with respect to potential climate change impacts. So want to gather data on source delineation, both laterally and vertically. Are there any preferential flow pathways in the subsurface? And really wanting to understand what the hydrogeology and groundwater bodies, is it unconfined or confined? So unconfined, it's shallow, it's going to be more conducive to climate change effects than say a confined water body at depth, which will be buffered to an extent. Have you got a granular aquifer or a cohesive aquifer? You often find more granular aquifers are more transmissive and could buffer the effects of kind of extreme or increased rainfall more readily than a cohesive aquifer. What's your unsaturated zone thickness? Have you got a high water table currently? Is it lower? Could that change in the future? Is there variation in groundwater levels? So really kind of thinking about seasonality in groundwater and whether that's something that needs to be considered further as part of your SI design. And also any hydraulic connection that there may be with identified receptors such as surface water, wetlands, or existing abstractions. And if you've got a surface water receptor nearby, think about your surface water flow regime, particularly under low flow conditions. And the image that you're seeing here is basically just some long-term water level data that's been collected via monitoring wells and also at river. And by collecting that, you can sort of see, if you projected rainfall as well, you can see how precipitation events can influence your hydrogeological and hydrological regimes. So really good site characterization is key. So, oh yeah, you can also consider what if scenarios as part of your CSM considerations, which is what we kind of went through earlier, part of the CSM. And these are also outlined and detailed thoroughly within table 3.1 of the guidance, and it includes extreme weather events and long-term climate change effects. So going back to the example site, we have done an investigation at the site. So what's that telling us? We found a source. It was of restricted dimensions. The geology was till and it comprised interbedded, cohesive and granular strata. We had a high water table, particularly where the source was present, and also surface water ponding. So really, groundwater level is not going to rise any more than it is. And you can see by the topography of the site, it sort of is partly on a hillside and then flattens out. And this flat part is kind of part of a floodplain. The groundwater flow is controlled by the granular strata. So although there was maybe cohesive strata at surface, there was some granular strata beneath. The cohesive strata wasn't acting as a confining layer, so it was an unconfined aquifer. But because flow was primarily within the granular strata, any changes in water level would unlikely have an impact on the site based on the granular strata being deeper than the cohesive near surface. And also showed in a previous slide that there's no changes to off-site surface water floodplain. So putting this all together and the fact that the recharge projected was projected to be less than 10%, although near that limit, just having gathered the site investigation data and thinking about the site conceptually, for this site, I don't think future climate change is going to have any significant impact on the risks to the water environment. So I said that's just an example I've gone through and how I've applied the guidance. Okay, so going on to tier 3 and considerations for DQRA for climate change. It's really only going to be applicable where climate change has been identified as a relevant consideration following tier 1 and tier 2. A point to note is that it's only long-term climate change effects can be assessed quantitatively. Short-term extreme weather events can only be assessed qualitatively via the what-if scenarios that we've included in the guidance. However, extreme weather has been with us forever. It just maybe more we're seeing it happening a bit more regularly than we would like now. But it is something that just needs to be considered, but it will just be a qualitative assessment for your short-term extreme weather events. Another point, climate change is transient, so your median is always in flux, but commercially available models aren't able to cope with that, and also projections are only available to 2100. So an approach we've put in the guidance to consider this is that you could model for specific time periods, for example, near term, using data from the 2050s and then the 2080s, and then you'd have to combine your results, and this would just allow a bit of a course assessment. Not ideal, but working with what we've currently got, it's an approach that could be considered. When you're doing your DQRA and it's a climate change consideration, things to think about would be changes to the source, so your source dimensions and concentrations, the pathways, so are any of your pathway lengths to your receptors changing, and also indeed your receptor, could the designation of the receptor change as well. In terms of sensitive hydrogeological parameters in the model that you probably want to have a look at, that would be recharge primarily. I've already mentioned the eFlag portal providing information on that. And that has a knock-on effect to your groundwater elevation, which can affect your unsaturated and saturated zone thicknesses, and also your hydraulic gradient by virtue of kind of Darcy law considerations of groundwater flow. Also, if you have a surface water receptor and you're looking to do a dilution assessment, then your surface water flow could be affected. So looking at your Q95 or low flow conditions, seeing what projections are available for that. And I should point out, eFlag does allow that. It's got basically drought characteristics and low flow conditions projected for both the near future and far future across the river network. So it's a really valuable tool, eFlag, for getting data that's relevant to our risk assessments. I also have a think about the nature of the hazard and longevity of the risk to see whether you need to consider climate change in your DQRA. If you do a DQRA under current conditions and it indicates a very clear and obvious risk, then the outcome of your risk assessment isn't going to change by considering climate change, although it might affect your remedial targets that you calculate, but it isn't going to change the risk. However, if your site is a borderline pass or fail, then climate change influences really do need to be considered, as this could confirm whether or not remedial action is required. Okay, so coming towards the end of the presentation, and this slide just outlines a list of useful data sources that we've found. Full list is provided in section 5.1 of the guidance. Already mentioned eFlag. It's a very useful tool. I can't stress that enough. If you've got coastal sites, then there's a coastal screening tool and national coastal erosion risk mapping. Although I think One of them, I think, is just specific to England and Wales only, which must be the coastal risk screening tool. The other one says national. Also, since our issue of the guidance or publication, it's not included as a reference because it came out in March 2022, but BGS have a geocoast data set, and that's worth a look as well if you've got a site near the coast. So just to sum up and conclude, climate science is complicated. Guidance data sets and regulatory policy is continually being reviewed, researched and updated. So it's worthwhile making sure you're looking at the most up-to-date data sources. We've provided the most up-to-date ones within our guidance up to the end of January last year. And I've tried to kind of indicate where there's been updates or where there may be updates as part of this presentation. Climate change effects may or may not, as the example site showed, fundamentally change the SPR linkages being considered. This could be changes to source contaminant behaviour, active pathways, proximity to or type of receptor. There's regional variability across the UK with respect to climate change. It's not going to be a blanket approach or a one size fits all. You really need to look at your site-specific conditions to understand the impact to your site. Extreme weather events can only be assessed qualitatively, but your long-term climate change effects can be assessed both qualitatively and quantitatively. It should be something that is considered at the outset from tier 1. And it shouldn't just be thought of as a bolt-on sensitivity analysis at DQRA. Because as I said before in the hopefully I've highlighted some cases, it may not even be relevant or required. So it's something that you should have a think about at the outset. Really good site characterization is key to understanding potential future implications of climate change. And what needs to be done is to incorporate climate change projections and explore the consequences within risk assessment. And the SOBRA guidance provides more detail than I've been able to provide in this presentation, but hopefully it's been useful. And that just leaves me to say thank you for listening, and I appreciate I've gone slightly over the time, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Perfect, thank you for that. It was great to go through the guidance and also see how you've applied that to different sites. We do have a couple of questions, so I'll just get started on them. From Daniel, is the EA internal guidance planned to be released or turned into public-facing document? Does it put consultancy industry developers at a disadvantage if the EA are applying standards or policies that we can't access?
It really is just an internal document for them just now. At the moment, I don't know. I'm not a regulator, but I can say that the EA, CPA and NRW were involved in the production of our SOBRA guidance. So they're on board with the approach that we have taken. I think there are plans ultimately for regulators to develop their own policy in this area to inform things. But as I've pointed out in the presentation, it's such a fast moving science. There's lots of updates continually happening. I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges that we faced when we were developing the guidance, while we had to kind of draw a line in the sand as to the data sources that we would use. But yeah, I think it really was more a literature review and kind of thinking about how climate change could affect permitting sites that the EA use. But they're not public documents, but I think there are plans that they could be developed into something that could be published externally.
Fantastic. Daniel has another question. Have SOBRA considered where the consideration of future estimated changes in site conditions within the UK regulatory framework can suitable for use take consideration of future climate change considerations, or is this tool envisaged as something that informs clients on future proofing developments?
Yeah, it's basically to make sure, so there's a lot of guidance that we've got, so GPLC2 within the planning framework, and other documents, LCRM, they all say climate change should be considered. And we've also got a British standard that was issued was it last year, a couple of years ago, which looks at considering future foreseeable events, which includes climate change. So we've got all this guidance that says it needs to be considered, but there wasn't anything to say how you should do it. And that's the reason the SOBRA subgroup formed, was to try and produce some guidance to provide a method or a framework that people could use when they were assessing sites to show that they had considered climate change within their risk assessment. And yeah, it was just really to make sure that it could be applied something that could be applied consistently across industry, and just to make sure that the development remains sustainable. I mean, it may be something that isn't going to be applicable for all sites, as I kind of pointed out with my example site I'm currently looking at, but there may be other sites where you are seeing more extreme weather, particularly those on the coast, southeast England, where you've got kind of your winter rainfalls projected to be much greater. You could have coastal erosion, changes to sea level. So those sites may be ones where climate change is actually going to be more of more significance than kind of say something more inland. But it does need to be considered site specifically, and hopefully we've provided a bit of a framework to allow you to do that.
Perfect, thank you. For coastal areas, is there any consideration in the guidance for anthropic land subsistence, superimposing to sea level rise due to climate change and the modelling of these effects?
So as I said, we provide a list of data sources that you can consult, and it would be a case of risk assessors looking at those data sources and just putting their risk assessment hat on to consider whether it's something that needs to be considered for the site or not. We weren't producing data sources for this. We were just looking at what existing data there was and how that could be applied to the risk assessments that we do.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. I think this is the last question. So Rebecca's asking, Helen, thank you for today's presentation, a great summary of guidance. Up front, you mentioned a large number of R&D activities with different bodies and that climate change is a fast-moving area. Are there plans for the working group to review the guidance at set key points in time, such as following publication of the R&D documents mentioned?
Yeah, good point. We've actually put it in as a caveat within our guidance that we plan to review it within 2 years. So as you can appreciate, SOBRA is a voluntary organisation. A lot of this was done in our own time. And there could be other documents coming out. I mean, it may be that regulators produce their own guidance within that time frame. But at least for now, the SOBRA guidance provides a framework. But yes, there are plans to review the guidance within 2 years. And as I already mentioned in the presentation, there have been data sources published since that aren't included, but I've tried to provide that in my presentation. But yeah, there are plans to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. I found that interesting. Just for anyone that wants to have a look at the guidance, there is a link on our website, so you can find that there. So that's it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in. I hope you found that beneficial and informative.